Bérubé was a self-taught and politically engaged community historian whose work, among other things, brought together queer history and labor history. He was also a very dear friend. I knew him through the San Francisco Lesbian and Gay History Project from the late 70s to early 80s. And he was probably best known for his Lambda Literary Award-winning book, and we have a few copies in the table back there, called Coming Out Under Fire, The History of Gay Men and Women in World War II. A subject they would have said couldn't be written about until Allan went around the country doing the oral histories and finding the resources to write it. He also wrote extensively on the history of sexual politics in San Francisco and on the relationships among sexuality, class, and race. For over 2 decades, Allan crisscrossed the country, presenting highly popular slide lectures to lesbian and gay community audiences. And John D'Amelio and I, as you heard a moment ago, edited a book called My Desire for History, Essays in Gay, Community, and Labor History by Allan Bérubé. There's a few copies back there also, which includes some of his classic published work, but also much of his unpublished work, including some of the work on the MCSU. Last summer, John and I did a book talk at the Gay and Lesbian History Museum in the Castro, and one of the people in the Q&A afterwards said, could you reproduce the slide lecture on the MCSU? And I said at the time, well, if I could hire a graduate student to help me find the slides, maybe I could. And it was Catherine Powell's invitation to speak at this event tonight that provided the impetus to me to make that happen. So I want to thank you for the invitation, Catherine, but also I want to thank archivist Rebecca Kim from the Gay and Lesbian Archives for arranging to have the slides scanned, and history graduate student Annalise Hines for entering them into PowerPoint and then assisting me as I created this edited version of Allan's much longer slide lecture. Eventually, I hope to make the entire slide lecture available on the web. Now, I want to devote most of my time tonight to the MCSU, so I won't talk too much about Allan Bérubé, but I do recommend highly the biographical introduction that John D'Amelio and I wrote in the first chapter of My Desire for History, in which we try to answer a question that Allan himself once posed, which was, how did a Franco-American kid raised rural and working class in New England, whose earlier family history included no self-identified intellectuals or homosexuals, how did I learn to become this new thing, a gay community-based historian? And we asked some other questions. We explored how this 1960s conscientious objector, an anti-war activist, came to write the definitive history of gay men and women in World War II, and how this college dropout became a self-taught, influential historian who in 1996 won a prestigious MacArthur Foundation Genius Award. And how, in the process, he sustained his political activism, sharpened his own class and race consciousness, and continually inspired community building wherever he went. I also want to provide just brief context for this project. First, to note that Allan's interest in the MCSU grew from his previous work on World War II and on San Francisco. For the Navy and the Merchant Marine figured very importantly in the story about gays in the military during the war, and the San Francisco Bay Area was a major center for shipping and for the Navy. A number of Allan's informants in his oral histories about World War II had prior histories at sea and were or knew of others who were involved in the maritime labor radicalism of the 1930s. In addition, to these contexts, Allan brought to this project his theoretical work on queer work and the intersections of whiteness and sexual identities. He also brought his skill as an oral historian and historical researcher. He meticulously pored through labor periodicals, the radical press, the mainstream press, to reconstruct the history of this exceptional union. He immersed himself in the trade publications and the business records of the shipping industry. He particularly looked at those who worked with the luxury liners on whose cruises many of his working class subjects were employed. What he uncovered was a queer labor history. A generation before the formation of an identity-based social movement that addressed sexuality, some working men in the maritime world were able to embrace their sexual or gender-crossing selves on the job and get union support for doing it. So as he had done before, Allan prepared a slide lecture on the topic that served both to educate and to facilitate future research. He presented no race baiting, red baiting, or queer baiting around the United States many times. Determined to scrutinize the unconscious whitening practices that had tended to erase the presence of people of color, he reconstructed a surprising tale of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, politically radical, and queer-inflected union. The story was unlike anything that appeared in the annals of either labor history or the history of sexuality. Indeed, after hearing the lecture, one prominent labor historian responded, and I quote, "This is truth stranger than fiction." You will see. Before his death, Allan had thoroughly revised at least a third of the book manuscript. We do not know if anyone will be able to complete it based on the drafts in his papers. I'm hoping to recruit someone tonight. In the meantime, I can offer you a taste of the story in this version of no race baiting, red baiting, or queer baiting. After which I'm going to suggest some themes we might discuss about his lively pictorial narrative. And so I will now become Allan. No, I think I'd like the lights to be on because I won't be able to see the script and I won't be able to see you either. So if you can't see, come up closer. There's some seats in the front rows. Act 1, hopelessly divided. The Lurleen is about to embark on her maiden voyage from San Francisco to Honolulu. Among her passengers is William P. Roth, the president of the Matson shipping line, his wife, Lurleen, and his family. Also aboard are business executives and government officials, as well as society matrons and teenage debutantes. As the passengers walk up the gangway, they can see longshoremen below busily loading their trucks along with the ship's supplies. The Lurleen is the queen of the Matson Company's new quartet of luxury liners. Her sister ships are the Malolo, the Monterey, and the Mariposa, the grandest American passenger liners sailing the Pacific Ocean. They have been nicknamed the White Ships because their hulls are painted a dazzling white that makes them stand out with a, quote, gleaming radiance, quote, on the blue Pacific waters. The Matson liners also stand out with another kind of whiteness. The purser and the rest of the service staff who politely greet the Roth family, carry their luggage, and lead them along the corridors to their first-class suites are white men and boys. So are the longshoremen and the officers and crew of the ship. These workers are white because Mr. Roth's policy is to hire only white men. The maritime unions have their own whites-only policies, too. The ship slides out from Pier 32 to begin her long voyage to the Hawaiian Islands, the South Seas, and Asia. In travel brochures and ads, the Matson Company has constructed a colorful fantasy world in which smiling Hawaiian women and men invite white tourists to their islands, which Matson partly owns and which the United States has colonized as its territory. Mr. Roth is gambling that there are still enough people with the money during the Depression to pay for the expensive luxury suites that will make his new ocean liners profitable. The round-trip fare for a 2-week cruise starts at $250. His gamble's paying off. Even the luxurious lanai suites that cost up to $2,400 a week sold out months ago. This maiden voyage of the Lurleen is reserved for first-class passengers. They swim in outdoor pools, play tennis, shoot clay pigeons. At night, they eat dinner in the grand air-conditioned dining room, where waiters seat them at intimate tables and they dance to the strains of Hawaiian musicians. Here is every aspect of luxurious living, promises Matson's travel brochure, and naturally the service is just as impeccable as the whole conception of this maritime existence. deck, where passengers never go. The stewards who provide this impeccable service are living a very different maritime existence. Most of the 350 members of the Lurline's crew work in the stewards department. They are usually all men, but occasionally 2 or 3 women work as nurses or stewardesses. Many stewards will never see the light of day while the Lurline is at sea, because they're forced to live and work below the waterline, with no portholes or fresh air. They sleep in hot, cramped quarters they call the glory holes, or the black hole of Calcutta. Mr. Roth's company requires his stewards to work up to 16 hours per day, 7 days a week, with no overtime pay and often no time off in port. He pays a messman $6 a week. Under these conditions, Mr. Roth expects his stewards to greet passengers with a smile, carry their bags, manage the front desk, wait on passengers in the dining room and on the decks, deliver room service, organize deck games, serve the drinks, cook the meals, wash the dishes and pots and pans, feed the crew, make the beds and put away the clothes and linens, run the elevators, work the telephone switchboard, nurse the passengers who get seasick, cut and style their hair, and give massages. The stewards do the work that is expected of them. The few who serve passengers directly can sometimes receive good tips. But at night, when the stewards finally stumble below deck, sitting on their hammocks and bunks, they dish the passengers, their supervisors, and the ship owners. Matson calls the luxury liners floating hotels, but the stewards call their quarters floating tenements. There are 40 waiters in one glory hole, Jim Vieira, a former steward, says. We were sleeping above the engine room. If you set your shoes on the deck when you went to bed, in the morning they'd be curled up. The toes were meeting the heels from the heat. As a teenager, Jim Vieira went to sea on the Matson lines as a scullion washing dishes in the galley. He quickly worked his way above deck as a first-class room steward. His service is so good that the Roths choose him to be their personal room steward whenever they sail to Hawaii. But on his first trip out, young Vieira notices something queer among the stewards. In the galley, he recalls, or in the dining room, when there weren't any passengers around, all the stewards called each other by girls' names. Miss this and miss that. When he gets up the nerve to ask them why they did this, they say, well, doesn't everybody do it? Well, he realizes, I guess I must be a girl too. So that's how Vieira discovers that there are lots of other gay teenagers and men like him on the liners. The cooks and stewards are at the bottom of the crew's social hierarchy, below the captain and his officers, the firemen in the engine department, and the sailors or deckhands in the deck department, who all do the traditional manly work. The stewards do what is stereotyped as women's work or colored work, the personal service and the housekeeping. Some stewards' jobs are also stereotyped as queer work, activities that gay men are supposed to be especially good at. Pastry chefs, waiters, bedroom stewards, pursers, wine stewards, florists, hairdressers, telephone operators. Now anybody can do these jobs, but many of the stewards doing queer work are in fact gay men. And this is no secret. Even in the 1930s. It was never hidden, Jim Vieira says. I can't say the stewards were 100% gay, but 65 to 75%, and everybody knew it. Rumor has it that the Matson Company likes to employ gay stewards on its ships. A Matson official once told Vieira that if it wasn't for the boys, who else would we get to do that kind of women's work, to turn down the beds and lay out ladies' nightgowns? What the Matson official also meant was, what other white men are we going to get to do who do this colored work on our all-white crews? So many of the stewards on the Matson liners are gay that the ships themselves earn queer nicknames among seamen. They call the Lurline the Queer Lean, the Matsonia the Fruitsonia, and the Mariposa the Mariposa or the Fairyposa. Crewmen on freighters call Matson's white liners the fruit boats or the fruit ships, and this kind of contempt was known among stewards as queer baiting or queen baiting. Gay stewards prefer to